The biggest man, a giant with a skull tattooed on his shaved head, sneered, his voice a low rumble. "Look what we have here, boys. A movie star." He shoved Seagal's shoulder, a test of dominance. "I think it's time someone taught you what a real fight looks like." In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the bar's dusty air crackled with a violence so swift, so absolute, that the bikers would spend the rest of their miserable lives trying to understand how it all went so wrong, so fast. The Red Dog Saloon was the kind of place that clung to the edge of a forgotten highway like a stubborn weed. Its neon sign, a flickering red hound that had lost its flicker years ago, cast a tired, blood-colored glow on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 cigarettes, the smell of stale beer, and the low murmur of men who had nowhere better to be. It was a place where trouble wasn't just expected. It was the main event. Tonight, the headline act was the Iron Skulls Motorcycle Club. They weren't the most notorious gang in the state, but they were the most notorious in this particular 100-mile stretch of desolation. 10 of them had rumbled in an hour ago, their Harleys shaking the very foundations of the cheap-built saloon. They were large, loud, and draped in leather vests that bore the grinning, iron-helmeted skull of their namesake. They owned the bar the moment they walked in, their laughter and crude jokes drowning out the jukebox's sad country songs. At the far end of the bar, almost swallowed by the shadows, sat a man who seemed to be the antithesis of everything the Iron Skulls represented. He was a large man, to be sure, but he sat with a quiet, almost meditative stillness. A simple black silk shirt, dark pants, and a signature ponytail were his only adornments. He nursed a glass of iced green tea, his eyes half closed, his presence a pool of calm in an ocean of manufactured chaos. It was Steven Seagal. He was on a cross-country drive, exploring old blues routes, and had stopped for a brief respite, completely unaware he had wandered into a den of local predators. The bikers paid him no mind at first. They were too busy harassing the bartender, a weary man named Gus who had seen it all and knew better than to protest. But as the beer flowed, their boredom grew, and their eyes began to roam, looking for a new source of entertainment. It was Breaker, the club's sergeant-at-arms, who noticed him first. Breaker was a mountain of a man, with a gut that spilled over his belt and arms like tree trunks, covered in faded, prison-quality tattoos. "Hey, Rhino," Breaker grunted, nudging his president. "Check out the big shot in the corner." Rhino, the leader of the pack, turned his head. He was leaner than Breaker, but a wiry strength coiled in his frame. His face was a roadmap of bad decisions, with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow and a nose that had been broken more than once. He squinted into the gloom. "Well, I'll be damned," Rhino chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Is that who I think it is? Mr. Hollywood?" The other bikers turned, their collective gaze falling on the solitary figure. A wave of snickers and jeers rippled through their group. They saw a relic, a star whose light had faded, a man famous for on-screen fights they believed were nothing but smoke and mirrors. "Looks like he's seen better days," one of them sneered. "Think he's here to shoot another one of his straight-to-video masterpieces?" another added, eliciting a round of boisterous laughter. Seagal heard them. He didn't move, didn't open his eyes, but his senses, honed by decades of intense martial discipline, were on high alert. He could feel the shift in the room's energy, the predatory focus now aimed squarely at him. He had hoped for a quiet stop, a moment of peace, but he knew that peace was no longer on the menu. Rhino slid off his stool, followed by Breaker and 3 other skulls. They moved with a practiced swagger, a slow, deliberate procession designed to intimidate. They formed a semicircle around Seagal, blocking his path to the exit, their bulk casting him deeper into the shadows. "Evening," Rhino said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. He leaned his knuckles on the bar, his scarred face just inches from Seagal's. Didn't expect to see a celebrity of your caliber in a place like this. A little far from Beverly Hills, ain't ya? Seagal finally opened his eyes. They were dark, placid, and revealed nothing. He took a slow sip of his tea before answering, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. Just passing through. Passing through, Rhino mimicked, looking back at his men, who chuckled appreciatively. We're the welcoming committee. Name's Rhino. This here is Breaker, Snake, Tiny, and Gus the bartender's worst nightmare. He gestured to each man in turn. Tiny, ironically, was the largest of them all, a veritable giant with a shaved head and a skull tattooed over his entire scalp. Seagal gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I don't want any trouble. The words hung in the air, the classic line of a man who was about to find it. For the iron skulls, it was blood in the water. Oh, we're not trouble, Rhino said, his smile widening, showing a row of stained teeth. We're fans, big fans. We love your movies. All that fancy hand-waving and slapping. It's real, artistic. The insult was clear. They were questioning the very foundation of his identity, the legitimacy of his martial art. They saw Aikido as a dance, not a combat discipline. It was Tiny who decided to escalate things. He reached out a hand the size of a dinner plate and shoved Seagal's shoulder. It wasn't a hard shove, just a demeaning, dismissive push. A test. I think it's time someone taught you what a real fight looks like, Tiny rumbled, his voice thick with malice and cheap beer. And then, it happened. It wasn't a blur of motion, not in the way movies depict it. It was something stranger, more profound. It was as if time itself warped around the man in the black silk shirt. Second one. The instant Tiny's hand made contact, Seagal's body didn't recoil. It flowed. He didn't move back. He moved with the push, absorbing its energy. His center of gravity dropped slightly. His right hand, which had been resting on his knee, came up in a smooth, almost lazy arc. It wasn't a fist. It was an open palm, a blade of flesh and bone. Second two. As Tiny was still processing the lack of resistance, Seagal's hand made contact with the biker's wrist. It wasn't a grab. It was a connection. His fingers wrapped around the wrist joint, his thumb finding the precise pressure point on the underside. Simultaneously, Seagal's left hand came up and cupped Tiny's elbow. He was no longer being pushed. He was now redirecting the entire force of the larger man's momentum. Tiny's forward lurch became an uncontrolled, spiraling fall. Second three. With a subtle twist of his own hips and a slight extension of his arms, Seagal executed a perfect kotagaishi, wrist return. There was a sickening, wet pop as Tiny's wrist bent at an angle nature never intended. The giant's roar of aggression turned into a high-pitched scream of agony. His massive body, now completely off balance and guided by an unseen force, crashed face-first into the solid oak bar. The impact was thunderous, rattling every glass and bottle. Tiny went limp, out cold before he even started to slide to the floor. The other four bikers froze, their jeering smiles vaporizing. They had expected a scuffle, a clumsy exchange of blows. They had not expected this. This was something else entirely. It was surgical. It was silent. It was terrifying. Second four. Snake, the wiry one to Rhino's left, reacted on pure instinct. He swung a wild haymaker, a punch born of panic rather than technique. Seagal, still seated, simply leaned back, the fist whistling past his face with an inch to spare. The motion was so economical, so fluid, it was like he was merely dodging a fly. Second five. Before Snake could retract his arm, Seagal's left hand shot out and seized the extended limb. He used Snake's own momentum to pull him forward and down. As Snake stumbled, Seagal's right elbow rose to meet his descending face. The crack of bone on bone was sharp and final. Snake's nose flattened against his face in a spray of blood, and his eyes rolled back as he collapsed into a heap on top of the unconscious Tiny. 2 down. 3 seconds of actual combat. Second 6. Breaker, the sergeant-at-arms, let out a guttural roar and charged, lowering his head like a bull. He was going to tackle Seagal, to use his immense weight to crush the man against the bar. It was a foolish, telegraphed move. Seagal didn't even stand up fully. He pivoted on his stool, his right leg sweeping out in a low arc. It wasn't a kick, it was a trip. His foot connected with Breaker's leading ankle. It was the principle of the lever, a small force applied at the right point to topple a massive object. Second 7. Breaker's charge became a clumsy, flailing tumble. He bellowed in surprise as his feet went out from under him. As he fell, Seagal rose from his stool, his movement like a cobra uncoiling. His hand chopped down on the back of Breaker's exposed neck, hitting the pressure point at the base of the skull. Breaker's roar cut off instantly. He hit the floor with the unceremonious thud of a sack of cement, completely immobilized. 3 down. The last conscious biker, the one who hadn't been named, stared in wide-eyed horror. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. He looked at his 3 fallen comrades, then at the silent, imposing figure standing over them. He took a half-step back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "No, man. No," he stammered. Seagal didn't even look at him. His attention was solely on Rhino. Second 8. Rhino was the president for a reason. He was faster, smarter, and more vicious than his men. He hadn't panicked. While his men were falling, he had reached behind his back and pulled a heavy, wicked-looking Bowie knife from a sheath on his belt. The blade caught the dim light of the saloon. "Fancy moves, old man," Rhino hissed, crouching slightly, the knife held low. "Let's see you dance with this." Seagal's expression didn't change. The placid look remained, but his eyes were now fixed on the blade, his focus absolute. He stood in a classic Aikido stance, 1 foot forward, hands open and relaxed at his sides. He was a statue, a monument to potential energy. Second 9. Rhino lunged. He didn't go for a wide, telegraphed slash. He went for a professional gutting thrust, straight and low, aimed at Seagal's abdomen. It was a killer's move. Seagal moved. He didn't retreat. He advanced, stepping inside the arc of the knife. His left hand descended, not to block the knife hand, but to parry Rhino's wrist, deflecting the point of the blade just enough for it to slide harmlessly past his hip. Second 10. In the same fluid motion, Seagal's right hand came up under Rhino's arm, his fingers finding the nerve cluster in the armpit. He applied pressure, and Rhino's grip on the knife faltered for a microsecond. It was all the opening Seagal needed. His left hand released the parry and clamped down on Rhino's knife hand, securing the weapon. Second 11. Now in complete control of the weapon and the man holding it, Seagal pivoted. He used Rhino's own forward momentum, twisting his body and applying an armbar lock. Rhino cried out as a fire of pure agony shot up his arm and into his shoulder. The knife clattered to the floor. Second 12. Seagal did not release the lock. He increased the pressure, forcing Rhino down to his knees. The biker president, the terror of the Red Dog Saloon, was now helpless, his face contorted in a mask of pain and disbelief, held effortlessly by the man he had come to humiliate. Seagal leaned in close, his whisper a cold wind in Rhino's ear. "You talk about real fights. You know nothing. A real fight is over before the loser even knows it's begun. It's about ending the threat, not about ego." He applied one final sharp twist. There was a distinct, sickening crunch as Rhino's elbow dislocated. A raw, guttural scream tore from Rhino's throat, a sound of complete and utter defeat. Seagal released him, and Rhino crumpled to the floor, clutching his ruined arm, whimpering. The entire confrontation, from the first shove to the last scream, had taken less than 15 seconds. The bar was silent, save for Rhino's pathetic moans and the buzzing of the broken neon sign outside. The remaining 5 bikers at the other end of the bar were frozen in place, their faces pale with shock. The bartender, Gus, was hiding behind the counter, peering over the top with eyes the size of saucers. The last standing biker near the carnage simply turned and bolted out the door, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Seagal stood for a moment, his chest rising and falling in a single calm breath. He looked down at the human wreckage at his feet, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph, no anger. There was only the quiet finality of a storm that had passed. He walked back to his seat at the bar, picked up his glass of green tea, and took a sip. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the counter. "For the tea," he said to the still stunned bartender, "and the disturbance." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the Red Dog Saloon, his footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. He disappeared into the night, leaving behind a legend that the locals would tell for decades to come. They would speak of the night the Iron Skulls tried to bully a quiet man and were dismantled, piece by piece, by a force they couldn't comprehend. They learned that some men are not what they seem, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room is the one that sits in perfect absolute stillness.